Byline Audio.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
This episode is brought to you by Amazon. The holidays are here, and you know what that means? It's time to get your friends and family the gifts they deserve. Take the stress out of shopping with Amazon's great deals and low prices on a huge range of items from toys to tech and much more. Whoever you're gifting for, Amazon has great prices on everything you need this holiday season. Shop last-minute deals now.
Hi there and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times with me, Adrian Goldberg. This time a marriage made in Mar-a-Lago. Apparently, Elon Musk and Nigel Farage got together in Donald Trump's Florida resort to discuss, amongst other things, funding for Reform, the right-wing party that Farage leads, of course. Reform's treasurer, Nick Candy, played the role of best man. Not much competition there, I suppose. But all joshing aside, Farage has acknowledged for the first time that money was discussed amid speculation that Musk, a key backer of Trump, is now considering a significant financial contribution to his favoured faction on this side of the Atlantic. Ironic, you might think, that Farage, chief engineer of the Brexit campaign, a staunch advocate of UK sovereignty, would allow an American tycoon to buy influence on our politics. But is there anything we can do to stop it? And do we need an overhaul of the entire system of party donations in the UK? We're joined on this episode of the Byline podcast by Karam Basra. Karam is the Deputy Director of Engagement for Unchecked UK, which argues for better regulation to protect citizens. And Tom Brake, former Lib Dem MP, who served in Parliament for more than 2 decades and is now director of Unlock Democracy, which campaigns for democratic reform in the UK. Tom, I want to start with you. Obviously, you've been there, you've seen it, you've done it inside Parliament. What do you make of the idea that Elon Musk might be donating as much as $100 million, 78 million quid, to one party in our country?
Well, obviously, the fact that this very large sum is being discussed has brought this to wider attention. But of course, it is the case that in UK politics, unfortunately, all of the major parties rely very heavily on large donors. So looking at the stats from 2023, I think 83% of donations to the Conservatives were from donations of over 100,000. For Labour, the figure was 87% from donations of over 100,000. And frankly, the Lib Dems and the other parties often are also beneficiaries of very large donations from a very small number of people. So I think this was an issue before Musk and Farage were talked about, but clearly what it underlines is the urgency of doing something about it. And we've got ideas about what we could do about it, which I'm happy to come on to later.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. But I don't know if you saw a recent report by Transparency International saying that almost £1 in every 10 reported by political parties and their members since 2001 have come from sources that Transparency describes as either unknown or questionable. So there's money coming into our politics. Sometimes we talk about dark money on the Byline Times, money from opaque sources wielding who knows what influence and on whose behalf, we don't know either.
Indeed. And in the case of, for instance, Elon Musk, I assume he's not on the electoral register, so he's not a UK citizen, so he won't be donating via that route. But if he has companies in the UK, currently he could donate $100 million or £80 million or whatever the equivalent is through an ex company that was based in the UK. Now, frankly, who is it who is going to be authorizing that donation through that company if that were to happen? It would be Elon Musk. So very much a foreign national pumping large amounts of money into the UK through a UK company. But very often what happens is the companies through which these donations are coming don't appear to be actually doing any business. They're not actually making any profits. So they just seem to be, in some cases, a conduit for getting foreign money into UK politics. And that is before we move on to talk about things like unincorporated associations, which we've been looking at very closely recently.
But essentially, then you could, and we're not saying this for a moment is the case with X, but you could have a company, a shell company based in the UK, actually turning over zero profit, zero loss, but merely existing as registered at Company House, through which 80 million quid could be funneled.
Yes, certainly that's my understanding. Now, there have been calls by certainly Unlock Democracy, but also I think the Committee on Standards in Public Life, that if a UK company is going to donate money, it has to have been showing profits in the last couple of years. And it has to have been, I think, profitable to a greater extent than the donation that is proposed to come from that company. And I think that would help to close down that loophole, albeit what we need is a cap on donations full stop. And we favour a cap of £5,000 for an individual's donation every year and a cap on company donations of £5,000 a year as well, just to basically force political parties to go to a much wider base of smaller donors to fund their activities. And also what would be required, I think, now this isn't going to be popular, is I think we need to bite the bullet and accept that if we want to take big donors out of politics, unfortunately, the taxpayer might have to pay a little bit in terms of public subsidy towards political parties. Incidentally, that already happens through something called short money and through the free mailing that political parties get in a general election if they send out an election leaflet through the Royal Mail.
Karen, there are particular reasons, I think, to be concerned about the potential for Musk's donation. He runs a social media company, and the UK is preparing an online safety act, which would require companies like X to regulate their content. Now, we know from X's own history under Musk that he doesn't much like moderating content. He sacked loads of the moderators. So this isn't just about some theoretical potential influence here. He has skin in the game.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on, Adrian. Elon Musk is a canny businessman. I think he sees this as a strategic investment. He made a similar investment in the United States, about 200 million into Trump's campaign. He ended up with a plum government job at the end of it, leading the Department for Government Efficiency. What's he going to use that role to do? It's to gut regulators that are coming after him and impeding his ability to make money as he sees it. Now, he thinks that there's an opportunity to do the same thing here. That's what that £100 million is about. And there's definitely a target on the Online Safety Act, which he's called out a number of times. And he's also looking at other jurisdictions. So I think Australia he's mentioned. So I think this is something to be really concerned about. And we shouldn't be repeating the mistakes of the past, these kind of deregulatory mistakes.
And you mentioned other jurisdictions. We've seen similar influences playing out in other parts of the world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've seen this kind of playbook happen in Argentina, and that's kind of happening at the moment. I mean, I think the issue is that Musk thinks the country can be run in the same way that his social media company can be, right? So when he came into X, he sacked somewhere around 75% of the employees. And I think he thinks that you can do the same thing with government, with the state, without realizing that these folks, they actually do things. They, whether they test our water or make sure that the food that we eat is safe or ensure that people are being paid the minimum wage, right? These are key protections that he is gunning for. And I think we've got to be really cautious and on the lookout.
Tom, just so we're clear, there are regulations at the moment about how much people can donate and about declaration of those donations. Is that right?
Well, there are not, in fact, limits on how much anyone can donate in the UK to a political party. if we got a billionaire in the UK who he or she decided they wanted to donate billions of pounds to one or other political parties, they can do that perfectly legitimately.
Sorry, just a caveat there. At election time, though, that spending
So
would
at
be
election time, then there are limits. But one of the things that we would like to see is that the previous government introduced sort of unilaterally, without any real requirement for it, quite a substantial hike in the amount of money that could be spent in a general election from, I think, something like 17 million up to over 30 million. We see no need for that. And we would argue that it should be reversed back to where it was, because what we don't want to see in UK politics is what we see in the US, where when I've spoken to senior US politicians, some of them talk about spending 80% of their time fundraising. And obviously, the people they're raising money from, it may be that some of them are perfectly altruistic. They just know the politician, they want to give them some money and they don't expect anything in return. But unfortunately, I suspect rather a lot of them, as in, Elon Musk and regulation, have an agenda which they then expect that politician to deliver if they get elected. So we don't want to go down that route in the UK. So let's put a cap on what parties can spend nationally that is more stringent than the one that applies now. And one other area where we think legislation introduced by the previous government should be rolled back is what can be spent at a local level, because there are two pots of money that you can spend in a general election. There's a pot of money that you can spend promoting a candidate in a constituency. So formerly that would have been me promoting Tom Brake, that name in leaflets and so on. And that is a small pot of money. That's probably about, now for most constituencies, about £15,000. But what the previous government did was they said that the National Party, which has a separate pot of money, which is about promoting the party, can, as long as the local agent doesn't know about it, come and spend almost as much of that money in that local constituency as it wants. So you could get the 15,000 spent on promoting the candidate, and then the National Party can decide that of that 30 million or thereabouts, it's going to spend 10% of that in one constituency. And as long as the local agent doesn't know, then that's fine. And clearly that is a nonsense, because it completely blows apart that constituency limit, which in the past has made UK politics perhaps slightly more accessible to basically anybody, because you're not spending hundreds of millions of dollars as they do in the US. You're spending £15,000 on promoting a candidate in the constituency. That enables sometimes independents, for instance, to stand. But if the national parties are suddenly focusing a very high percentage of their national pot on a very limited number of seats, that makes that local sort of threshold completely meaningless.
The one thing that I would add to what Tom's just said is a lot of these ideas, the kind of ideas that Musk is pushing, are just not electorally popular. So people want strong protections. They want them enforced. We've done lots of polling with groups like More in Common and found that across the board, across a whole set of different demographics, including reform-inclined voters, they actually want to see their rights properly enforced. They don't want to see sewage discharge in their rivers, those sorts of things. So, the fact is that people like Musk and others of the similar sort of ideology have to resort to this kind of pouring of money into politics. And it's not just Musk, I should say. There's a whole set of actors who are sort of coordinating to deliver similar results.
Yeah, I mean, there would be an argument then, Karen, wouldn't there, that let the battle of ideas commence. And if these ideas about slashing red tape, which you argue leads to more sewage in the rivers and so on, is not popular in the country, then people will vote against it.
But it has to happen on a level playing field, right? And I think that's exactly what Tom has just said, is once you sort of pour money in, it leads to all sorts of electoral issues and odd outcomes.
Of course, the established political parties who have to make laws around this subject are themselves in hock to big donors, aren't they? Whether it's the Labour Party, reliant on primarily the trade unions, whether it's the Conservative Party, who are very reliant, for example, on house builders, very big capitalist donors. They are the turkeys who would be expected to vote for Christmas if they try to bring in some cap, aren't they, Tom?
Well, they are, but polling shows that the public, and they're right, unfortunately, believe that their views are of far less importance to political parties than the views of the big donors. And that is not a sustainable viewpoint. I think from a public perspective, I would hope that introducing a cap, and as I said, we think a cap of 5,000 would be something they would support, because then they will know that they stand a reasonable chance of their views being as listened to as anyone else's, because no one person or no one company is able to dictate policy in one particular area of government, because the government knows that that party or that person has donated a large chunk of money, and come the next election they might be dependent on that person or company for a large chunk of money to run their campaigns. So I think it's worth pressing. But I do think that the point that I mentioned earlier about the public perhaps being willing to entertain the idea that if they want to take big money out of politics, then political parties do need money, and that, yes, there is already money coming in from the state, but maybe the taxpayer might be willing to contribute a little bit, and it wouldn't be very much. And in return, they would be certain there are not 10 donors, because often it's that number, 10 donors who are by far and away the largest contributors to the different political parties and will be exerting influence. If a party tells you that is not true, at the very least, and I can confirm this from my own period as a member of parliament, if someone is donating money to you, when they send an email or when they ring and say, "Can I meet you?" you're more likely to find time to meet them. That doesn't mean that you're going to respond and say yes to everything they're asking for. In fact, you may well turn around and say, "Well, I don't agree with you." But the fact is they're going to get better access because people know that they've given money, and that is a reason perhaps to respond slightly more quickly to that request than to a request from someone who hasn't donated to your campaign.
I remember chatting about this very subject about 20 years ago, Tom, with Tom Watson, the former deputy leader of the Labour Party, who was a passionate advocate for public financing of political parties for exactly the reasons that we are discussing here. And nothing has changed. Arguably, the situation has got worse. I mentioned Labour certainly isn't clean. We've had the recent stories around Lord Ali's contributions, for example, the purchasing, as you say, not necessarily of direct policy influence, but the purchasing of access. And for any political party in government, it would be an extremely hard sell, not least because you have actors like Musk who would argue that spending taxpayers' hard-earned cash on political parties would be a waste of money.
Yes, so that is something that the advocates of caps on party donations have to respond to and have to have the answers. But it is a choice, I think. It's a choice between restricting the amount of money coming in from big donors and the taxpayer making a slightly bigger contribution than they already make, because the opposition political parties already get something called short money to help their activities in Parliament to scrutinise the government and hold the government to account. So the Conservatives get that, the Lib Dems get that, all of the opposition parties get that. And then separate to that, if a political party in a general election prints a leaflet, the Royal Mail is guaranteed to deliver one leaflet to every single elector free of charge. So the political parties have to print the leaflets, but the Royal Mail will deliver that free of charge. So there is already a degree of subsidy coming from the taxpayer.
And Karim, I think we can't ignore the fact that Musk is a very particular kind of influencer. Obviously, those of us who've studied the conventional media, the mainstream media over the years will know the influence of people like Rupert Murdoch, of Viscount Rothermere and his lieutenant at the Daily Mail, Paul Dacre. Musk is cut of the same cloth and arguably even more influential in the modern age. And his influence is for polarisation. This is a very particular kind of intervention in UK politics that we can't ignore.
That's absolutely right. What Musk is able to do at the helm of this kind of Department for Government Efficiency, it's just such a big role. He can sort of point to lots of things and say, delete it, in his words, right? He's talked about deleting regulation as though he can just take the approach that he's pioneered in his businesses and just plop it on top of government. And I just don't think that works. They want to start with the Department of Education and these huge swathes of government and think that you can just get rid of them without any consequences. And when questioned on this stuff, he sort of says, oh, well, if we get rid of something that actually matters, we'll just put it back in as if it's a line of code. Just this kind of thinking that is really insidious and dangerous. And I don't think we should be able to play fast and loose with the protections, those kind of vital protections that keep us safe at work and all the rest of it.
And again, in terms of those geopolitics, he's the representative of a government which certainly, as it's anticipating taking control in the White House, Trump has talked about the UK having to choose between the United States and the European Union, and that if we choose the EU as a primary trading partner rather than the US, that we could face tariffs. All of a sudden, this world of political donation, which is already quite toxic, now has this whole other sheen of geopolitics attached to it. It feels like very dangerous waters for the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just on that, when we go back to TTIP and things like that, to the trade agreement that was posed with the US, we went through 3 rounds of discussion and we couldn't reach a common set of standards. You'll remember all the fuss about chlorinated chicken and all the rest of it. I mean, the fact is that Brits want higher standards. They're politically popular. I don't think we should be compromising because Elon Musk tells us to. I think that's a really dangerous precedent to set. And this influx of money just muddies all the waters.
If Elon Musk does decide to proceed with getting rid of shed loads of regulations, I think what he will find is what was found here in the UK over Brexit, that there was this big bucket loads of regulations. But actually, when the government sort of went out and asked business in particular, tell us about all these regulations you want us to scrap, actually business didn't really want any regulations scrapped. And I think Elon Musk will find exactly the same thing in relation to US industries, that actually they want regulation because they want standards. They know their customers very often want them to be observing standards, and often their employees will also be pressuring them to observe standards. So I think Mr. Musk may be in for a surprise when he tries to slash regulations in the US.
Tom, that will chime with your experience in government as well, I imagine. Sort of under the coalition years, we had these kind of 1 in, 3 out mandates and things like that. And, the people behind them, like your old colleague, Vince Cable, has sort of said, actually, it doesn't work. You just don't find these things. There aren't these reams of red tape. And when you're chopping and changing all the time, it makes doing business that little bit harder.
When in government, we were looking at, so in coalition government, when I was a minister, and we were looking at this process of for every regulation that came in, we had to get rid of 2 of them. You could find regulations that you could scrap, but normally it was things like a regulation from the 1890s about someone walking in front of a bicycle with a flag. I mean, it was stuff that, yes, was still on the statute book, but no one had actually tried to enforce for the last 100 years.
It's of course one of the unspoken benefits of regulation is that, as well as the obvious health and safety implications for consumers, it actually can create jobs and wealth, because there's a whole world of compliance that very often goes with red tape as well. But Tom, let's address the geopolitics here. We have Farage, who has moved from the outer fringes of our politics to being, albeit the leader of a minority party in parliamentary terms, to arguably the most influential politician of our age. He managed to generate the momentum around Brexit, and he's now been spoken of as a potential prime minister. And I remember from a long way out, people talking about Boris Johnson, before he was even mayor of London, being a potential prime minister. And people never quite took Johnson seriously. Arguably, they never took him seriously enough. I would say it's not beyond question that Farage could become prime minister. And what do we then have? A prime minister who is, if his party is backed by Musk, who is financially in hock to Musk and who is very closely aligned with this very polarizing US president, Donald Trump. Is that too fanciful, too far-fetched to imagine?
No, I don't think it is at all. I think Nigel Farage has clearly been a very influential person in UK politics since before the Brexit debate and the Brexit vote. And he has managed to, without being a member of parliament, influence the UK's agenda in a very substantial way. So I think that the mainstream parties, and I include in that the Conservatives, need to be worried about addressing the challenges that the UK faces, addressing them in a serious way to be able to diffuse the rather simplistic solutions that Mr. Farage will deploy. And I mean, they're not that dissimilar to Donald Trump's in that the solution is often to identify someone who is to blame and then blame them and miraculously claim that everything will be resolved once you've dealt with this particular problem. And I mean, Brexit is a very good example of that. He and the Brexit supporters and the other parties went around the country saying, vote for Brexit and all of our problems will be resolved. Well, people did vote for Brexit in 2016, and very few of those, I think, would argue now that as a result of Brexit, their problems have been resolved. So we have to have the answers. We have to be willing to confront some of the issues and respond to them. And I'd include in that immigration, for instance. I'm not scared about talking about it, and we should talk about it. We should talk about, yes, the benefits. We should be open about that. And we should also talk about the disbenefits as well, so that he isn't able to claim that he's the only person addressing some of these issues that many voters are worried about.
Yeah, for people who missed it, there was a report earlier this year suggesting that Brexit had cost the UK so far £140 billion, and it's anticipated that it will make the UK £311 billion worse off by the middle of next decade. And people might say, well, okay, though, they're willing to pay that financial price because we have control of our borders, which goes to the immigration issue that you've just discussed there, Tom. And of course, we know that net immigration is now running at record levels. I mean, it is impossible, I would suggest, to put forward an argument that Brexit has in any significant way worked.
Well, I'm certainly not going to argue that it has in any significant way worked, but maybe Karun would like to do that, but I doubt he would like to either.
I think let sleeping dogs lie there. I think that might be the best approach.
So how would you sum up where we are now then, Tom?
Well, I would say that we need a strict cap on political donations. We would argue for 5,000 per individual or per company per year. That is the way that you very significantly reduce the influence of some of the large donors who are at risk of setting the agenda for the political parties because of their very high level of dependence on a very small number of large donors. So that's what we would argue for.
For us, it's not really about whether Musk could be allowed to make this donation or not. It's really questioning why he wants to do it. And we know what it is. It's about sort of bringing about deregulation. It's about gutting our protections. And we've got to say, you know, it's not just about Musk. It's about those ideas. And we've got to work on discrediting those ideas because they don't work in practice and they leave us all worse off.
Karen, thanks for your time. That's Karen Basra, Deputy Director of Engagement for Unchecked UK. Thanks also to Tom Brake from Unlock Democracy. I'm Adrian Goldberg. This has been the Byline podcast. And if you've enjoyed listening to this, then please follow us on YouTube or on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify or whichever streaming service that you prefer. And do leave a positive review if you want to as well. And if you want to support our work, please think about taking out a subscription to the Byline Times. Might make a good Christmas present for somebody else as well. If you're casting around thinking, what can I get that special person in my life? If you take out a subscription to the Byline Times, you get a fantastic monthly newspaper, which has the best of our online articles and content that you can't read anywhere else. And you'll be helping keep us on the air as well. Thanks very much indeed, Karen. Thank you to Tom. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Byline Audio.